G'day, guys, and welcome to the Centre Bounce for today's first episode of the Supercoach for Beginners series. We are joined by a very special guest. Stay tuned. Big J, we are joined by Jaden Poposki here from Jaden Poposki's own website. He's broken down the stats, and we're going to have him on the channel today. How are we doing today?
Mate, I'm excited. We think Supercoach has scored single way. You know, we have 3,300 points, and now we're finding out Supercoach has scored another way. I'm excited to hear everything.
Absolutely. Jaden, thank you so much for coming on. How you doing today?
Hey guys, it's great to be here, and yeah, I'm going pretty well. Starting to get into a bit more of the nitty gritty as we get further into the preseason, so I'm really enjoying that.
Yeah, absolutely. And we're just keeping track of those who follow you on the Twitter are seeing that you're putting out some more and more little profiles, little snapshots of individual players and some breakdowns of how they were scoring. So it's definitely getting, everyone's playing with their teams, and Supercoach has officially opened. So everyone from beginners to experienced players are all coming in to have some fun. And we're looking today to sort of shed some light on how the scoring actually works, because we want to get the most points every week, don't we?
Yeah, definitely. It's a weird one. Like, you think, hey, look, someone's going to do this way, all the stats across the board. Maybe I'm a bit of a spoiling into the episode today, but the stats across the board, I never really realized, Jaden, until I watched, until I read your article, that, hey, a kick in the forward line is actually worth more than a kick in the midfield, and the same in the defense as well.
Yeah, there's so many parts to it, and I guess it's been my off-season project. Like I looked back after I posted it, and I saw I created the file on November the 10th. So it's been a long time in the works. But yeah, I guess the first step was just to find out as much information as I could, so then I knew where to start.
I guess we'll start off a little bit. Start off a little bit about yourself. Obviously, we're going to link your website, link all your articles in the description of this video. But just kind of, where did you start? Have you always played Supercoach or fantasy? Do you come from like a statistics background, or is this more just a bit of a hobby for yourself?
It's kind of been a hobby for a long time. My dad taught me how to play when I was probably around 8 or 9, so I've been playing for most of my life. Back when Dane Swan was, he was my favorite player as a Collingwood fan. But yeah, and then I finished school and I moved to Hobart to do a statistics degree. I just always wanted to do that. And yeah, so I finished that off. But before I did finish it off, I wanted a bit more practical experience. So 2 years ago, I decided, okay, I'm going to have a real go at AFL stats because I really like it. So kind of started off just from scratch, not a lot to start off with, but yeah, I learn something new every day. So I just kept getting, more and more experience. So it means I can do really advanced things like this now.
And it's giving those edges too, giving the edge to everyone that kind of jumps in with your content, which is fantastic.
Yeah, that's certainly the goal. Like, the reason why I started doing it is, like, I've always thought of fantasy as like a hobby, but I really love data and I want to be able to use it. So when it comes to my own team, pretty much everything I post is like, I'm thinking about things for my own team. Like, I'm picking my Supercoach team right now, and I'm like, okay, well, I need to research my own players, and if I'm picking players, I want to know things about them. So I end up doing hours and hours of work researching them. And then it turns out people like to see that content because, at the heart of it, I'm doing it for myself. I'm doing it for my own team. And that's what it's always been about for me. It's not about just making content for the sake of it. It's like, I want to look into things that I'm actually questioning myself. I'm looking into. So that's the most exciting thing, because everything I come up with is just questions I have for my own team. So turns out it goes all right in the content space.
Oh, yeah. And I think that resonates with a lot of our viewers. Doesn't matter if they're beginners or if they're experienced campaigners. I mean, at the end of the day, everyone sort of wants to win. No one deliberately wants to go out of their way to start behind the 8 ball. And when you sort of ask these really important questions, like, what makes this player tick? Is this player genuinely worthy of selection? How do they get their scoring? That's definitely something that all of us really should be keeping in the back of our minds. And as we always say on the Centre Bounce here, that you really need to do your own research. You can always come and consume as much content as you want, but ultimately you need to do your own research and back your gut sometimes as well. Like if you think that there's going to be a change and you can predict the change into the future. What did you find was, I suppose, the most surprising or the biggest nugget of information that you sort of took away from doing your own research into these players?
Yeah, I suppose, and the premise of this chat right now is just to do with the scoring, and like I just wanted to have as many stats as possible that I could break down. So I guess while we are going to be talking about it from a Supercoach perspective and what they're worth, it's also really beneficial for me to like train this model on the Supercoach scoring, so I know I'm putting the right pieces in. But at the end, I've got all these pieces that I can use, and I can be like, these players kick it long very much, and these players are really good in the contested scoring. So it's more about the journey of putting all these pieces together than actually the end goal of making it accurate for Supercoach scoring. Like now that I've done that, I have all these pieces that I can work with, adjust it for different players, and be like, this is what they're good at, this is where they aren't so good. So that's what I'm really excited for over this preseason.
Yeah, it almost creates a bit of a story on the field, right? You can not have to watch the game, but you can kind of see where the ball's traveled and who's good at doing what, and what kind of the tendencies and the marks and things like that kind of, what's the right word? Some players geared towards doing a certain thing on field versus other players that might want to do something else.
Yeah, and something I've learned in that space, particularly breaking down stats in explicit detail, is there's so many stats we use that are actually better explained maybe in 3 or 4 parts. So like you said about the marks, we'll look at the marks tally on the AFL app after every game. We'll say James Sicily has had 12 marks, but the marks is just a total of all these other marks of contested, of intercept, of uncontested. So that took a lot of time for it, but just having those breakdowns, there's so much detail.
And all that detail and all that information you have put incredibly well onto your website article here. The link to that article will be in the description down below, guys. So don't you worry. We will be going over the article, but there are other things in there that we haven't put on here. But we'll start off, as you mentioned there, with some of these different sort of breakdowns of the scoring depending on where you are on the field. This is specifically in relation to the possessions. What is a loose ball get? Does it sort of just mean an uncontested sort of pickup of the football?
Yeah. Just before we, I guess, talk about stats individually, sure. I'd talk about the overarching reason for why Supercoach has scored the way it is. From everything I've learned over this preseason, it seems to be like which acts on the field are best explained to winning a game. So like if you're kicking goals are going to be worth a lot because they obviously win a game, but there's other things that are also really important. And that's why these possessions, contested possessions, most of them, like we always hear in AFL media, contested possession is the most valuable thing you can win. Coaches use it all the time. It's probably the number one stat at the moment. And that's why it's so important. And that's why they get fairly well scored compared to other fantasy games where they aren't scored at all. This is where Supercoach really shines, because winning these contested possessions, we all know it's really important for winning a game. And that's what the Supercoach scoring system tries to do by weighting the stats so that the most important ones get scored the best.
Yeah. I mean, we'll talk a little bit about disposals and things like that, but it 100% makes sense, right? Like if I'm a midfielder that kicks the ball to someone in the forward line, we always kind of hear the idea of scoring chains. But if I'm a midfielder that kicks a ball to the forward line, that mark that my forward takes is a lot more influential on the game, potential scoring and winning a game versus me just taking a mark in the midfield.
Yeah, so that's where like the efficiency of disposal and things comes in, and yeah, that's why these stats are broken down in midfield zone, in D50 zone, and in forward 50 zone. Because based on research I've done, it seems that inside the arcs, you're scoring around 20% more than the same act in the midfield. So we can kind of talk about the possession here. Loose and hard ball gets, you more commonly refer to those as ground ball gets. So a hard ball get is practically when you've got someone hanging off you. Like you're trying to pick up the ball off the ground, you've got someone hanging off you. If it's loose, you're kind of just picking it up on your own. There's not so much pressure around you. So they're worth a decent amount there, the most out of any on the possession page, because, you know, the ground ball gets at clearance, things like that. Then we have the crumbing possessions, which are from marking contests. So you imagine players like Luke Bruce, Isaac Rankin. There's a big marking contest inside forward 50, and they're at the drop of the ball. They pick it up and kick a goal. That's a loose ball get right there. Crumb. So that's what they're really good at. We've also got gathers, which is just imagine a player on your team tapping it out wide to you at a stoppage. They tap it to you and then you pick it up. So it's kind of like a gather. It's not you're doing the work of picking up the ball yourself as a ground ball get. So it's not worth quite as much. There's a gather from opposition, which is essentially just to intercept at ground level, not taking a mark. Gather from hit out, which is a direct hit out to advantage to you. So that's a bit easier than winning a ground ball get yourself, because the ruckman's just put it on your plate. So that's not worth as much. A handball receive, it's pretty easy. You can get that running pass, so that's only worth about 1 point. And then a free kick, that obviously pretty important for moving the ball along. But yeah, I guess the main thing with this stuff is I'm talking right here about, on average, what are these stats worth? So in these scenarios, they could be weighted really high because it's a close game. But on average, I'm saying a loose ball get is about 3.4 points. And then if it's in D50 or forward 50, it's worth 4. So there's a little bit of a boost there. But on average, if you're just watching along the game, you don't know anything about the margin. You don't know how close the game is, how long is left. You just want to know, what is a loose ball get around about worth? That's the point of this. It's around about the average of what it's actually rewarded.
And that a lot of that comes from like you watching the game and then looking at Supercoach on how the points have done, things like that, like going up, going down. Is that kind of generally how you worked it out?
Yeah, pretty much. In terms of the data I have, it's just like if you've ever gone on the AFL app, you can like watch player highlights, which are like very convenient. And what I essentially did was just stitch all of those together, so you can pretty much kind of like watch the game, but in an Excel form. You can just watch the ball like go down. So it's pretty cool. But yeah, that's kind of how I did it. It's kind of like watching a game, but looking at the data instead of watching it. So yeah, that's how I did it.
I've mentioned it heaps of times here on this channel as a resource for people to use, that the AFL app gives you different things to what the website can give you. Like if only we could get that information, watch all those clips on a computer. I mean, how much easier would it have made your life as opposed to having to use the app on your phone?
Yeah, that took quite a bit of time to figure out, because like you said, it's not on the website, and getting data off websites is quite a bit easier than, you know, having your phone here and trying to be like, okay, how do I convert this data? Like, how can I get it off my phone and onto the computer? That took a bit of work, but we're here now and we have all of these great values figured out.
A massive thanks to you, you absolute superstar. But it also, I mean, as you touched on before, it sort of makes sense, and it is a good thing that Supercoach actually goes out of its way in its scoring system to reward players for doing the hard work, as opposed to just simply, you know, taking the easy route. I know a lot of people just generally sort of compare Supercoach to fantasy in terms of, oh, there's no such thing as clangers in fantasy, and you have infinite trades. Looks like there's more to it than just that, based on, I suppose, the inner workings of the scoring system.
Yeah, and we've kind of known that for a while. It just seems, just from the information we've gotten in the past, it hasn't been the most amazing information because, you know, if we say a clanger kick is worth -5, but it always gets scaled to not be that much, like it's not really that useful to us. So that was kind of the goal of this analysis, to say, look, this person had 6 clanger kicks, and on average, a clanger kick is around -2.7. But yeah, so we have the disposals here. Effective handballs are pretty self-explanatory. And kicking it short versus kicking it long, there wasn't as much of a boost as what I thought from the difference between short and long. But I'm pretty confident that I've calibrated it correctly. What I actually had to do for these was figure out how far the kick went based on where the mark happened. So that took a fair bit, like distance calculations, and I did this over 3 years of data, so it took a bit of processing power, but we got there. So then the kick long to advantage. A long kick is 40 meters, but if you can hit someone uncontested, it's classed as a long kick to advantage. So that's worth a bit more because you're hitting someone who's on their own 40 meters away. That's pretty valuable. And then the caveat to that is that you make sure you're kicking it forward. So if you're kicking it backwards, that's around less than 1 point. So it's about the same as a handball, which is very interesting. James Sicily was number 1 in the comp last year for backwards kicks. So if he could maybe kick it forward a bit more, then there's a lot more points on offer.
He robbed himself of some points last year. Oh no.
Yeah. And then so we talk about effective disposals of hitting the target. There's also ineffective ones where you try your best to hit the target and maybe it just doesn't happen. Maybe it's spoiled away. Maybe it doesn't quite reach them, but you don't turn it over. That's the important thing. That's worth 0. So you're not going to lose points for doing that, but you're also not going to quite gain any. So ineffective stats worth 0. We've kind of known that for a while. But then the clangers come in where you're kicking it, you're handballing it, and it goes straight to the opposition. It's pretty not correlated to winning. You don't want to give the opposition the ball back, which is why all of them are negative values. And if you're doing it inside D50 or forward 50, it's going to be pretty detrimental, especially in D50 there. They're worth a bit more than the forward 50 ones. Like, you don't want to be turning the ball over inside your own defensive 50 because that's just going to lead to an easy goal.
I always think of when Jaden Stevenson ran out of our, I think it was ran out of the goal square and kicked it straight to the opposition, and then it was a goal. And it's like, mate, it's a bit of a waste.
And one more thing just there, the effective kicks backwards. There's no forward 50 value there. That's because if you're kicking it inside forward, if you're inside forward 50 already and you're kicking it backwards, that's just classed as a normal short or long kick. So that's actually worth around 3.2, which is the same as short kicking. So I did have that split up originally, but I think it's just, if you're chipping it to a teammate in a better position, even if that is backwards, you're still getting rewarded. And that's been validated in other resources as well.
I guess that makes sense, right? Like, it's effectively locking the ball in the opponent's defensive 50. So you moving the ball around, things like that make sense and is worth the value.
Yeah, especially if you set up a teammate in a better shot for goal. Like if you're right on the boundary line and you can hit someone who's maybe a bit further out but directly in front, that's still valuable.
Yeah, I reckon, I suppose, in terms of the clangers, I would imagine, I think that if you turn the ball over in your forward 50, you're probably trying to pass someone and you get a turnover. I think turning it over in your forward 50 is less dangerous than turning it over in the midfield with how quick teams can make you pay. I feel like if this was to properly, I suppose, I think this missed an opportunity to maybe, if you have a clanger in the middle of the field, I think that's more dangerous than if you have a clanger in your forward 50. So I would have imagined that clangers, the 3.3 for the minus 3.3, for example, for a forward 50 clanger handball might have been applied to the midfield, because you're now just one quick kick away from your defensive 50 and perhaps a goal.
Yeah, I did quite a bit of like ensuring that the stats kind of made sense. So we get like clanger totals, but they can be anything. That can be free kicks against, could be giving away a 50, it could be the kicks or the handballs, and there's a bunch of other things we'll talk about later. But I'm pretty confident that this is what a forward 51 is worth. And I think that because if you're inside your forward 50, you want to be trying to have an effective disposal. Otherwise, you lose the ball when you miss a chance to score. So, like, maybe that's why. The midfield maybe not as important because you're far away from goals anyway. But if you do it in D50, you're giving up score. But if you do it in your own forward 50, maybe you're losing the chance to actually kick a goal yourself.
Fair enough.
Mate.
It's all about opportunity in this game. And if you either give your opponent an opportunity or you give up an opportunity yourself, you get penalized for it, which makes sense. And I know this stat here, the kick-ins, is definitely on a lot of people's minds when they talk about, especially in our defensive primos in the back line, do these premiums take kick-ins? It's very important. We need them to take kick-ins. Well, we can see that they what they're worth now.
Yeah, this was actually one of the final steps I actually did in terms of the analysis. Like, I had all the other stats in there, and I was thinking, how can I make it more accurate? Pretty much the whole summer was like, I need to add more. How can I make it more accurate? I actually forgot about these kick-ins because they're actually broken down differently. And so there's 4 different main ones. There's potentially more, but this is what I went with because these are actually discreetly tagged in the data set I'm using. So they're actually named. I don't have to calculate the kick distance or anything like that because, players will run with the ball. So they can change how far they gain. But essentially there's 4 going on. So if you play on from the square, that's the first step. You get a little boost for that, 0.25. Not really sure why, but that was pretty I'm pretty confident in that based on how significant it was in making the data more accurate. And then after that, your disposal gets graded as a normal disposal. So you get a little boost for playing on out of the square. And then your disposal after that is based on the disposal table we just saw previously. Otherwise, the other 3 are taking it from the square, not playing on. So that's where the difference comes from AFL Fantasy to Supercoach. In Fantasy, you don't get a stat for a kick in, but if you play on and have a disposal, then that disposal gets counted. Yep. But in Supercoach, you actually do get rewarded for taking it from the square. If you kick it short, so under 40 meters, that's spot on 1 point. Kicking it long, 40 meters plus 2.75, which is pretty good. And then there's clangers, so turning it directly over to the opposition. So if you just kick it to them, that could be a long kick as well. Like you could kick it 40 meters and there's only an opponent there. That's still a clanger. Or out on the full. So that's minus 3.15.
Oh wow! Okay, I didn't actually know that in Supercoach that you still got points even from the kick in. I thought the if you didn't play on, that doesn't count as a statistic. I thought that was also for Supercoach, but turns out no. You can get points for kicking out of the square. All right, I've learned something new today.
Yeah, and that kind of is a bit more of a new change. Like they changed the ruling around how you can play on from the square. I know in fantasy in years gone by, like if you kick, how they used to kick it to yourself, like just onto your own chest, that wasn't worth anything. But then after that, things counted. So they changed it a little bit. And yeah, I didn't know this either, but taking it from the square is actually, it's not that bad, but you got to remember that you don't get a disposal for that. So you don't get scored on a disposal previously. Those kicks are around 3 points each. So you do actually lose out on points overall. So I guess that's why Supercoach fans will typically not want their players to be taking it from the square because you are going to get less overall, assuming you have it effective.
Yeah, right. I'll yell at my featured players a little bit less than what I have been in the past, being like, "You're not doing anything for me. What's happening?"
Yeah, it's not as you still get a few points for it. It's not black and white. There is a little bit of room in the middle, especially if they kick it long.
Fair enough. We then move to the marks component, and again, it's good. I love it that the that the tough marks, the contested marks, they're really hard to do. Like you're there, you're fighting one-on-one, or you're in a pack. It's one of those great feelings and one of those great things to watch in Supercoach. Honestly, it makes me feel happy to see how much more you get for a contested mark as opposed to an uncontested mark.
Yeah, and I think most Supercoach fans are across that. They understand how important contested marks are, and like you said, when you see one happen, that's big. Especially late in a close game, you can take time off the clock, things like that. But so on average, contested marks round about 5 points in the midfield, 4.1. So the ones inside forward 50, which is probably where they're most common, 5.3. So that's where the key forwards come into it that can take contested marks. There aren't a lot of D50 contested marks because those ones there aren't actually intercept marks. So you're actually saying your teammate has kicked it to you under pressure and you've still taken it contested. So there aren't many of those. So there's a few that kind of cancel each other out in this table, but overall it's pretty good. The uncontested marks aren't worth as much as what I initially thought. I was kind of thinking they were maybe around 3 or 4 points, but uncontested marks less than 2 on average, which I thought was really surprising. Taking a mark on a lead, that's kind of more for the key forwards again, like running out on a lead. So it's not really contested, but they've had to do the work to make it uncontested. So it's not as easy as not having someone on you. So that's why that's a bit more than an uncontested, but it's not so much as having a contested mark, someone hanging off you, if that makes sense. That's how I read into it. And then the intercept marking. So if an opponent has kicked it and you've taken the mark, that can be contested or uncontested. 9 points for a contested intercept mark inside your own forward 50. It doesn't happen very much because you practically need a stoppage inside your forward 50, a quick kick out, and you're taking contested mark, and then you can have a shot for goal. So players can get a massive boost for doing that. I watched a few of them on the AFL app. Like after I found them, I watched a few, and it's so important that players can do that, which is why they get 9 points for it. And then the intercept marks uncontested, they're worth around 3, so that's still pretty good. But that's pretty much relying on the opponent to have a clanger and kick it straight to you when you're on your own.
Yeah, definitely. We'll have a look at scoring next, but it really does show that some of these people who they've got a defender on them and then they jump up and then get a mark and things like that, why they can jump up like 20 points in a go, because it's their contested mark plus a goal plus potentially a kick and other things in there as well, right?
Yeah, so there's going to be the 3 things to it where, like you just said, the mark, say a mark inside 50, that's 5.3 for a contested mark. Then you have your kick and it's effective and it's inside forward 50, that's around 4. And then you get your goal as well, which I think is coming up next.
Yep.
Yes, sir.
That was an amazing segue. But goals on average 7.4. I've read plenty of times that around 8 points before they get scaled. So I think there's a lot of goals in the game, and some of those are way less important than others. So I can understand why it's pretty close, but not quite there. So it could start out at 8, but then just get weighted down a bit on average because games get blown out. So 7.4 for a goal, around 1 point for a behind, which is quite a big difference. And I think that difference helps to explain this kind of anomaly, what people have asked me about, where a goal assist is a bit less than a behind assist. So it is pretty interesting.
Baffling to me. At face value, that's a little bit surprising.
So this is actually something I did a lot of extra work on because I noticed this myself and I thought, this doesn't make a lot of sense. Initially, what I was doing, so goal assists are a common stat used, but behind assists aren't available anywhere. So I had to figure out those myself, and there was just a few inconsistencies as to when they were recorded, like whether I'm not sure. Like I had way too many behind assists in my calculations, so I was like, it's not really working. I need to find something better. So I eventually found score assists somewhere. So that's obviously a goal or a behind. So now I'm really actually confident in this being accurate. And the reason why I think a behind assist is worth, on average, a little bit more, it might not be they might just be worth 3.5 each, and then goal assists get scaled down a bit to start off with. But the reason I think behind assists are worth a little bit more, if you imagine the extreme example of a game with 25 goals and 0 behinds versus a game with 0 goals and 25 behinds, there's going to be 25 goal assists in one game and 25 behind assists in another game. That's looking at a 180-point difference just from the goal and behind totals. So there's a lot of scaling that would need to happen in that game. So that's an extreme example, but I think that's the best way I can explain it.
Right.
Yeah, definitely.
Yeah, because you need to get, because every game has 3,300 points, and that is fixed. You need to have 3,300 points per game, and that's where I suppose this extra scaling comes into play.
Yeah, so if you imagine like a goal assist is worth a bit less than a behind assist because a goal is worth way more than a behind.
Yes.
So if there's a game with lots of goals, there's going to be a lot more points in it than a game with less goals. So I think that's kind of where it comes from. It is a bit counterintuitive, but it kind of looks all right if you think of it like that, where a goal and a goal assist added together is a bit closer to a behind and a behind assist added together because they're reversed, if that makes sense.
Mm.
Right. Yeah.
I guess a little bit as well, right? I'm not sure if you can answer this, but it always felt like when there was a low scoring game, goals that players had scored might have been valued a little bit more, or obviously goals like after the siren, things like that, closer to the game being finished, that were really influential on the game. Were they valued a little bit higher, or is it kind of just blanket across the board and it's perception that makes it feel like it's worth more?
Yeah, so that does happen in Supercoach scoring. We know that happens. We've heard it plenty of times. Jordan Dawson's goal after siren last year was a good example. I know that was worth more than 20 points just for that goal. Maybe it included the kick as well. Yeah, so you get a massive boost from that. That's because it's close. It's because it's late in the game. You get a massive boost. What I'm trying to do with this analysis is essentially just give coaches an understanding of like, if they're watching along at home, regardless of thinking about the margin, regardless of thinking about how long's left, they can go, okay, a goal is around 7.4 on average. Mm-hmm. So they can apply that and be like, oh, maybe they've gotten a little bit more because it is slightly closer, or maybe they've gotten less because the game's over. So it's just kind of that idea of maybe, breaking down the stereotype of saying this is exactly what it's worth, because it's not. But more of just giving you an idea of what the average one is worth, which might be less than, say, the eight points that we get told it's worth. It's usually worth a little bit less with the games that are blown out. So, it's going to be a lot more valuable to apply this kind of thinking than giving a set value to everything.
Yeah, no, that makes sense.
Then move to the opposite side of the field when it comes to the defending. We love our good, strong tacklers, and I like it that the game rewards the tacklers for their hard efforts.
Yeah, tackling is very important. It's probably not worth as much as what I kind of thought. I know in fantasy and Dream Team, it's pretty much the most valuable thing you can do behind goals. But yeah, in Supercoach, you want to get those ones in D50 and Forward 50 because they're worth around 20% more off the top of my head. Looking at that. But yeah, so tackling's really important. I've also put spoils in here as defense just to make it so tackle wasn't all on its own. But spoils are actually included in the 1%ers, which we'll talk about later. And when I break down player stats, I like to include the spoils with the 1%ers. But spoiling is a pretty important thing as well, because if you've got someone like James Sicily or Tom Stewart or Luke Ryan, who kind of plays that role in between key defender and distributor, they can get a lot of points just by doing this as well. Based on my research, there were a few different types of spoils that I needed to separate to get more accurate. Because with all of these stats, I initially tried it just as spoils altogether, but there needs to be more detail if I wanted to get it more accurate. So there's effective spoiling, where you're spoiling the ball and you hit it straight to one of your teammates on the ground. So your teammate takes the next possession. So now these are calculated manually. So I just figured out if the next possession was your team, then I counted that as an effective spoil.
Yep.
The official stats providers might have a slightly different definition, but I just went with as close as I could get. And you can tell that the stats are all worth different things, that it actually paid off instead of them all being worth the same. So there's enough distinguishment there between the stats, which is really exciting. Effective spoils in D50 are a lot more common. They aren't worth as much. And I think it just comes to your ground position. Like, you want to be effectively spoiling as close to your own goal as possible. So forward 51s are worth a lot, mids a bit less, and D50 at the bottom. So the further up the ground you can effectively spoil it to your teammate, the more likely you are to score. Because you're not really, like, you're kind of just stopping the opposition. But effective spoils also sets you up in attack because your team has now gained possession.
Yeah, exactly.
Neutral spoils, pretty much just causing a stoppage, getting it out of bounds, or no one really takes possession of it. So it's usually causing another set play. Pretty typical spoil, hitting it out of bounds. So this one's reverse. You want to be doing it more in your D50, kill the ball. So the D50 is worth more, mids decent, 2 points, and then in your own forward 50, you don't really want to be killing the ball in your own forward 50. No. You want to keep the ball alive. You want to create chances. So that's why I think it makes sense. And then ineffective is the opposite of effective, where you're hitting it to the opposition. Pretty much, I think the reason why the forward 51 is worth a bit more is spoils inside forward 50 are actually a bit more common than what people think. Based on just looking through the games, they're pretty common because sometimes the forwards are out of position and they actually need to stop the key defender from intercepting. So that's why I think it's worth a little bit more, because you're essentially like keeping the ball alive instead of letting them mark it if you're out of position. So I really like that. It kind of makes sense. And then there's gaining possession, which is, this one was a little bit weird. Where it's like I had to calculate if the spoiler was the first player to win possession after they've spoiled it. So there's that one. I know that's included. And yeah, it seems like, again, you want to be doing it in your own forward 50. So you imagine, I don't know, I can imagine like Toby Green probably doing this, where he's slightly out of position, you tap it away from the defender, and then you get it yourself. Like, you can do that. You can do the spoiling high, but then you get it yourself and you kick a goal. So that's why the forward 50 is probably worth a bit more than the D50 and mids.
I guess that's where the D50 as well. It's like you'd rather have the player going for a contested mark or a mark or things like that. So spoiling it and then having to go chase after it's worth a little bit less.
Yeah, and I think the important thing with the game possession is that is scored as spoil alone. And then the way I've set it up is the possession that also gets scored. So that they can end up being a pretty valuable thing, but it seems they're essentially the same as effectively spoiling it, getting it to your teammate. It's the same roughly as picking it up, but then you also get the bonus possession out of it, which can be around 3 or 4 points.
Yeah, I really hope. What was it? Was it Chapman for Fremantle who did the game-saving spoil on the goal line against Adelaide? They needed a point to draw, but for him to get the win, he spoiled it away from the goal line right on. It was the best spoils I've ever seen in my life. I should look into that and see whether or not he got any extra scaling for that, because that was a game-saving spoil.
I believe he did. I think maybe they put it out afterwards saying how important it was. So I think that would have been probably an effective spoil, because I reckon it would have been his teammate to grab the ball after. I can't exactly remember, but yeah, I'm pretty sure he got quite a big boost for that, because it was, in D50, right on the line, close game, late in the game. So yeah, that's where these can vary quite a bit.
Awesome. Then move to the Ruck Contests. I know a lot of people are just going to be going with this standard Gordon Grundy, tried and true sort of rucks, especially this year, correct, with the value that they pose. But it's not just simply about getting a hit doesn't necessarily mean that if you touch the ball, you're going to get points for it.
Yeah, for sure. I'm rocking with Gorn and Grundy at the moment. Locked that in pretty quickly. But yeah, the hitouts are pretty interesting. I did have a bit of trouble with these, mainly because I guess the main problem is we talk about hitouts to advantage where you tap it to your own teammate, but then we talk about the opposite where you hit it to the opposition. Typically, that's called sharked hitouts. That's not. I couldn't find that anywhere. I couldn't get that into the model. I couldn't calculate that. I couldn't get it accurate. So essentially, what I did was like, I'll call it a hit out to opposition. If the first possession is won by an opponent, I'll just call it a hit out to opposition. What I found was they were around twice as common as a sharked hit out based on little calibrations I did from where I could find sharked hit out notes. So it's not exactly right. But if you think about sharked hit outs, we kind of associate them being worth -1 points. Here, they're worth -0.5. So they're around twice as common. But overall, I think it's way more accurate than just using hit outs, which is why I did include it. But it's not quite to that level of detail that Supercoach themselves use. But, you know, I had to do the best I could. So there's the hit outs to advantage, which are worth quite a lot, especially inside your own forward 50. And that will also get rewarded as a goal or behind assist. So you can get a massive boost from that from a ruck. And then the hit out to opposition, tapping it to an opponent. And then there's also the ruck hardball get. Pretty much what this is when you grab it out of the ruck and then you can do whatever you want. So that's kind of more of a possession type one, which is kind of why it's pretty similar in terms of how much it's worth with the hardball gets and the loose ball gets earlier. But yeah, it's good to know that the rucks get rewarded for that when they actually don't in other fantasy sports.
It's always your bit of knick-knack feature, right? Like grabs the ball out of the middle and bursts from the pack and then will get his kick. Imagine you do that, you get a goal. Something that I found from this as well is it obviously is ruck contest. So those ruck forward players, the ones that might pinch kick in the ruck, that kind of thing. I know North Melbourne's got a few. You always hear about some other clubs having them as well. Getting those extra points is really influential in that forward 50.
Yeah, there's certainly a lot of clubs that have, if they don't have that dual ruck set up, then the key forward will have to do that. Like Joe Danaher, Taylor Walker, people like that. So, and like I said, if you're doing that inside forward 50 and you can get it to advantage, while these key forwards might not be the best rucks, they could get a big boost because a hit out to advantage in your forward 50 is probably going to lead to a score. So you're also getting a score assist. And so that's why it's so important.
I wonder how much Big Sammy Draper would have got for that goal of the year, where he took it out of the middle, out of the air, a run, a handball at the top, got it back, shrug, kick, goal. Sammy Draper. I'm getting excited again. I'm sorry. But he would have got a lot for that, I would imagine.
Yeah. And these are the acts what we think, they're going to be worth so much. And like the things just add up because there's so many stats that are involved. So I guess just having these breakdowns all in one place, you can really imagine how the game is played a bit better.
Yeah, exactly.
And it really shines with players like you imagine a Witz from a couple of years ago. You always hear about him being a really good tap ruckman, right? Well, now we can see where he is on field, kind of where that's beneficial, but also him versus other rucks that they're not as tall, right? So they maybe will hit it out, they get a touch, but it goes to the other team, that kind of thing as well.
Yeah, and Witz is really interesting in that case, especially inside D50, because he can still tap it to his own team when the risk is high. In the top 5 players from gathers from hit out, which is receiving the hit out to advantage inside D50, it is pretty rare. But Rao and Anderson were both in the top 5 for that stat last year, and I'm pretty sure there was some Freo boys up there as well. So the ruck plays a big part in getting those mids a boost inside the D50 and forward 50.
Yeah, definitely.
Yeah, I was going to say, like, if Sean Darcy, big Sean Darcy, is fit over there at Fremantle, I imagine that it'd be a massive boost for anyone wanting to start Andy Brayshaw Sarong, even Young this year, because he's going to be featuring more in the middle. Because I think Sean Darcy is also one of those types of players using his big size, his big body. I think he's happy to get a ruck hard ball get and then feed the ball out as opposed to just constantly hitting all the time.
Mm.
Yeah, I'm just saying if I have it here.
Yeah.
Yes.
All those times where the opposition doesn't nominate a ruck and then your guy can just grab it and then do whatever he wants with the ball. Yeah.
Yeah. So last year, Max Gawn grabbed it out of the ruck the most in the midfield zone. He did that 56 times. Oscar McInerney was next. McInerney in D50 was the leader. And then in forward 50, it was Sean Darcy. So just like you mentioned there.
And we also spoke about some key forwards who might be the ones that get involved. I wonder if that also has a part to play in why the big Tom Hawkins over there at Geelong has continually, I think, scored pretty decently, because I think he's got a patent on the push out and in the forward 50. You know what's coming, but it's so hard to stop.
Yeah, for sure. And they get a big boost for that, 4.1 points compared to 3.4 in the midfield. So the top 5 last year for grabbing it out of the ruck in the forward 50 was Sean Darcy, as I just said. Joe Danaher, which is another forward taking Ruck Contest. Taylor Walker was next. Toby Nankervis and Tom Hawkins at number 5. So there you go. You're spot on.
Get around us. We know our stuff here, boys and girls. Subscribe, please, to the channel. We then move to the 1%ers. I know you also were talking about the spoilers before, how you like to include them as part of the 1%ers. These are a bit more of a detailed breakdown.
Yeah, this was actually quite difficult to do. So if you're watching in the AFL app, you can see where the 1%ers are, but they're not classified as anything. So they're not actually broken down like this. So there was a bit of manual calculation as to what's gone on. So say, for example, if someone's taken possession and an opponent somehow gets a 1%er, you probably know they've smothered the ball, especially if there's no disposal after it. So there was a lot of kind of breaking it down. And that's why there aren't as many 1%ers as what there maybe might actually be. But I've broken it down as best I could, based on the differences. So we talk about blocks. It obviously leads to a mark. So, there's been a block in there. But yeah, contested knock-ons and knock-ons. You want to do it contested, just tap the ball on. And the knock-ons kind of are a bit more like, it's kind of, I've seen Braden Maynard do it a lot as a Pies fan, where he instead of spoiling it, it comes to him on the bounce and he ends up just like double fisting it out of defense. So it's not really a spoil, but it's a knock on and it's not contested because he's just trying to get it out of there. So it's not worth as much as a contested knock on. Contested knock ons, Bont was like 2.5 times more than anyone else last year in the comp. So that's where he gets a few points from, because they're worth quite a lot. And then Smothers, Shepherds, blocks. And like I said,
in the forward line is the big stat.
Yeah. I didn't actually know where to put the running bounce because it's not actually included in the 1%er total, if that makes sense. Like we have easy access to how many 1%ers the players do, but I just chucked it here at the end because it is important. And, bouncing inside your forward 50 means you're probably about to get a goal. So maybe there's a little bit of overlap there, and that's why it's worth so much. But it's the best I could do with that.
If all of a sudden Anthony Caminiti starts taking bounces inside forward 50, I think I know what the reason behind that is now for.
Yeah, there you go.
And yeah, the last one, they're being touched. If you just touch it on the line to rush it through for a behind, that can obviously only happen in D50, and that's worth the most out of pretty much any of those, which is pretty important as well.
Yeah. There's, I suppose, a spin-off on the knock-on. I know there are people, it's very natural, I suppose. You're in a contested situation. There's a lot of bodies around, and you just get a quick dribble kick, for example, out of congestion to sort of get field position. But those could very easily turn into a turnover. In those sort of circumstances, if only it would have served those players better if they just simply knocked the ball out of the stoppage. Is there any sort of turnover associated with a knock on, or is that just a safe way of moving the ball forward?
I'm not entirely sure. I think there is like an additional part to it, like knock-ons being effective. I couldn't really figure that out. But funnily you mentioned like kicking it off the ground. Ground kicks I did actually have in this model, but it actually turned out they weren't any different. Like they weren't statistically significant different from just normal kicks. And they're counted as a kick if they're effective. So that's why it's all combined in just as a kick. But so you still get points for doing that. Just not quite as much as a contested knock on.
Gotcha. No worries. Then move to the dreaded clangers count. Some of these are sort of given on the AFL website, but there are others, I think, especially like the dropped marks, for example, that you just, I think, would that have been manual on your, your efforts?
Yeah, so clangers was also difficult. It kind of gets more difficult as we go into the video of how much effort I had to put into it. The clangers are hard because people will look at the clanger counts on the app, on the website, and they'll be like, oh, okay, this player's had 30 disposals, but they've had 15 clangers. And they always associate it with turning the ball over by foot, by hand. But it actually includes a lot more than what you think. So there's free kicks against, which are worth around -3, and then a 50-meter penalty against if you go the next step. It's only around 6.3. I kind of thought it would be a bit more, but I don't have that broken down by zone because I couldn't get that. But I just got the raw 50-meter penalty counts. And on average, around 6.3 points lost, which is by far the most negative act you can do, which makes a lot of sense. Dropping the mark, essentially, the drop marks, they have a little bit of nuance to them. If you drop the mark in the first scenario where you don't gain it, you've pretty much dropped it and you've lost possession, or it's gone out of bounds. You've pretty much lost possession of the ball. So that's why it's pretty negative. It's pretty much the same as a free against, like you've lost possession of the ball there. But if you manage to gain it back yourself, and that if you do it uncontested, then that's what you call a drop mark gain. So you've gained the ball back. It doesn't really affect the team that much because you've just dropped it and then you picked it straight back up and you kept going. It doesn't really change that much. But if you do it inside D50, you can see it's pretty not good. That's because massive. You've gone from the chance of having a set play with a mark, and then you've kind of had to play on automatically. But the thing to remember out the drop mark gains is you'll then get a possession point as well. Right. So that could be around 3 or 4. So they're not quite as much as the normal drop mark,
unless you turn it over. Unless you drop the mark, you gave possession, you put yourself under pressure, and as a result, you turn the ball over. That would be disastrous.
Yeah, especially if you don't pick it back up yourself. And then there's a debit stat. This is kind of interesting. I didn't actually know what it was. So I saw they'd written down that debits are part of clangers. I'm like, I don't really know what this is. So I went through and I found them in the data set. And I went and watched the videos of them, and it's pretty much where you go up and so does one of your teammates, and you manage to like ruin their chance of marking the ball. Okay. So you imagine that you can imagine it in like maybe North Melbourne's backline. I'm not sure if you've seen that, but they can in forward 50 it happens a bit as well. But yeah, you pretty much like one of your teammates is about to mark the ball and you go for it as well, and you kind of ruin that chance of marking it. So it's interesting that's included. But yeah, it's worth a significant amount there.
So it's kind of like a spoil on your own team almost.
Yeah. So it's not so bad, but it is negative points. And then the most common one out of kind of those bottom 4 is the no pressure error, where you just kind of drop the ball. So you kind of imagine it as like a bit more of those clearance players where they get the ball out and they try and run it out, and then they accidentally drop the ball before they kick it out of there. So it happens a bit more, and it's probably not something that we ever think about because they've kind of taken possession, but then they haven't disposed of it because they've dropped the ball and just lost it under no pressure. So they do get a fair negative impact for that, but it can be made up by the possession, essentially.
Yeah. Do slips count? Like if you slip over, does that count as a no pressure error?
I think it's pretty much to do with losing possession of the ball, which is a lot of these. Like essentially what a clanger is losing possession of the ball. So you've either given a free kick away or you've handballed it straight to the opposition. You've ruined your own teammate's chance of marking it, or you've dropped the ball. So pretty much all to do with losing possession. I'm not sure if slips would be included, but I reckon it is if you drop the ball.
Yeah, fair enough. But there are some stats that aren't included. There are a few people that I think a lot of people do know about. But some of them, for example, like clearances. I know a lot of people like to talk about clearances, and they might think that there is points associated with those, but there really isn't anything.
Yeah. And like I said earlier in the video, I think there's a lot of stats that can be better broken down in more detail. So when we talk about even just the first example of ground ball gets, whether it's loose or whether it's hard. So a lot of these are just better broken down by other things, or they're worth zero. So essentially how I know this is from my model, which variables don't add any accuracy at all. Like they aren't significant. You can get rid of them and nothing would change. So clearances, it's better explained as a possession, and then the disposal. Inside 50s aren't significant. It's probably because you're getting a disposal. You could score yourself if it's outside 50, or you assist someone. And, you know, even that little forward 50 boost potentially if you run it in. Meters gained, the long kicks are 40 meters. So, and meters gained is some like pretty correlated with Supercoach points, but the thing is, like, you got to have a lot of disposals to get high meters gained. So, you know, if that makes sense, you're probably scoring well if you're getting a lot of disposals anyway.
Correct.
The hit outs plainly are worth zero. So if you do nothing with your hit out and just tap it straight back out of bounds, you're not getting anything for that. It's only if you tap it to your teammate, you get rewarded, or if you tap it to the opposition, you get deducted. The same with ineffective kicks and handballs, pretty much. If you're just kicking it and then it ends up going out of bounds, or like not really reaching where you wanted it to, as long as it doesn't go to the opposition, you're not going to get penalised, but you're not going to gain what you could if you had effectively disposed of the ball.
I guess with that, with the ineffective kicks, handballs, you would get a negative though if like it resulted in a free kick, right? Like a free kick against because you've kicked it out on the full, or does it not count at all?
Yeah, so that would be a clanger if you kick it out on the full or to an opposition player, things like that. But ineffective, it's kind of a weird definition, but it's pretty much just like if you kick it and it accidentally goes out of bounds, or like your teammate like doesn't really get it and just gets spoiled away. Like it can be effective if it's pretty long, but it's all about whether or not you maintain possession or not. And if that's not your fault, then it can just be classed as ineffective.
If the game turns to a last touch out of bounds, then I think we'll have a lot less ineffective kicks and a lot more clangers in that game setting.
Yeah, sometimes it can just be just a gain ground. So, but they're not really getting rewarded for that because they don't get possession. There's score involvements, score launches. Pretty much like there was nothing to do with this because score involvements include the goals you kick yourself. So if I have 8 score involvements and I kick 5 goals, then I've only had 3 other times when I've helped the team to score. And then if you also take out the assists out of that, you're pretty much talking about players 2 or 3 or more acts up the line that are helping to score. And then pressure acts, so the tackling is included in that. And kind of some of the other ones, 1% is a little bit, but yeah, just not significant, better broken down by things that are already there. Turning the ball over is pretty interesting because people usually say, oh, they've kicked the ball to the opposition, or there's been an intercept mark where it's contested, like that's the players who's kicking it fault. If it's 40 meters, how they've classified it is it's still effective if it goes 40 meters because the ground you've gained from that is essentially the same value as turning the ball over, if that makes sense. So it can still be classed as effective. It's not a clanger if you kick it that far because it's not really your fault. And so you can have a long kick and it be a turnover, and that's still fine. If it's shorter than 40 meters and it doesn't go to a contest and you've kicked it straight to the opposition, then it's a clanger. So that's kind of what most of the turnovers, but it is still possible for it to be a turnover, but it's not so bad for yourself. And then the last two, just one-on-one marking contests. We have these stats available. They didn't add anything to the model. Typically, that's a contested mark if you beat someone one-on-one. And then the intercepts, like I said, could be an intercept mark or the gather from the opposition if it's on the ground level. So they're better broken down by those two.
Wow. Thank you so much. That's insane. So much work and effort would have gone into this. I can't imagine.
Yeah, it's been a long project, but like I said, the benefit is like now I have like 60 more statistics that I've never used before in my 2 years of doing this that I can play around with, long kicks, knock-ons, things like that. So it is really exciting, and it's great to have the Supercoach score there to kind of calibrate that I'm doing things correctly. And now I have a better breakdown of how players are scoring, how that can affect where they are on the ground, things like that.
I guess we're going to have a couple of questions maybe before we wrap up today. Thanks again, Jaden, for jumping on, spending your time and teaching kind of the newer fans and the older fans, intermediate fans, bloody hell, everybody who's watching kind of more than what they would have known, right? Stats kind of, there's always an article that comes out sometime during the AFL season that says this much is worth this, but sometimes that's not always the case.
Yeah, and I guess the point of my analysis is to make it a bit more useful for coaches. It doesn't make any sense for us to think of as, I always go back to the example of a goal being worth 8, but they vary so much that often it's actually not worth 8 and it's a bit less because we get these blowout games. The game's over at 3/4 time. Like it happens a bit more than what you expect. So the goal actually gets weighted down somewhat. And yeah, it's just all about applying, a bit better of an idea of what it might actually be worth so that when you see a goal happen, you think, okay, well, this is only 7.4 points instead of 8. And it might be a bit more accurate than what you've typically done in the past. I did a similar analysis last year where I applied these kind of known values to the stats that are going on, and it just blew everyone's numbers out of the water. Like the scaling would have to bring back 20, 25 points off each player. Like it was just too much. Like it didn't make any sense. So using a method like this where we perhaps say it's worth a little bit less overall due to these blowout games and things like that, you can get a bit better of a picture that you can apply to any situation.
Have there been any players that after kind of doing the spreadsheets and doing all the analysis that are either better or worse in your eyes in Supercoach or just as a player in general?
Yeah, it's a great question. I think there's something I haven't really looked into kicking that much, just because the kick stats that we have available easily aren't that good. We just get a kick total and how efficient that kicking was. But now we have a bit better of an idea of we want these players to be kicking it effectively, first of all, but then also kicking it long, or maybe even kicking it long to advantage. These players that take on the hard kicks and deliver it really well, they can get rewarded massively in Supercoach, which is why that scoring system is so calibrated with winning games. The things that you watch during a game that look really good, just know that your players are getting rewarded for that. So kicking is something I want to look a lot more into, especially these long kicking players like Luke Ryan. He does it all the time. They're players that you might really want to consider because, they just kick it long every time. That's worth more than just kicking it short. And if they're in D50, I know from a fantasy perspective, Luke Ryan scored the most D50 points last year by a long way. He just sits inside D50. So if we translate that to Supercoach, he's getting a boost for pretty much every stat he's doing.
Yep.
So things like that are really useful for me to look into from a player perspective.
Bloody Luke Ryan, tell you what.
What do you have against Luke Ryan, Big J?
Oh, mate, the guy that scores points out of nothing.
No, we can see why he's scoring points.
Yeah,
It's
I know. It just feels that way.
I know it feels that way, but that's why we're having this discussion, why we've had Jaden on today, to help us have a breakdown of how the scoring works so that our amazing viewers can sort of get a better understanding of what they should be looking for in their players, and maybe really if they can identify, you know what, they might not be necessarily the best player out there, but if they play in the right position and they play in the right way, then that could be enough for them to be worthwhile Supercoach selection options. And a massive thanks to you, Jaden, for coming on tonight and helping us give us such an incredible breakdown. It's been an absolute pleasure.
Yeah, thank you guys for having me on. It's great to kind of be able to talk through it. Like, it's been a long time in the works. And like, there's been a lot of time where I've been on my own trying to figure things out. But now I'm just really confident in how especially with like things like the spoils, it just makes sense. Like from a winning game perspective. So like, it's really promising to know that like the way it's scored is so reliant on how to win a game. So yeah, thank you for having me on.
Yeah, 100%. I guess kind of we'll ask two questions. Where can our fans find you if they want to get involved and check out your stuff? And what have you got coming out, or what have you just put out? Obviously, the spreadsheet aside.
Yeah, you can find me the best on Twitter or X. Just look up Jaden_Poposky. I have all the fantasy tags inside my bio, so make sure it comes up for you if you're searching for that. Yeah, there it is right there. And yeah, going pretty well with it. And yeah, I'm also on Instagram if you prefer that platform, Stats by Jaden. Trying to get that going a little bit. I'm not really sure about how Twitter is going in the near future, but yeah, so pretty much I just post the things I'm looking into for my own team. And yeah, as 5,700 people agree, that's pretty good for your own team. So it's really promising to see the community also want a bit more of, you know, this deeper analysis, this like more detailed breakdown of what's going on inside the game. And that's what I'll try to continue to do every time I spend time on things like this. Like, I'm trying to answer questions for my own team, and turns out it's pretty useful for yours as well.
Yeah, I'm taking a bit of interest in your Jack Sinclair, where he plays and he scores piece at the moment.
Yeah, so I'm looking to do a few more of those over the coming weeks. So if you've got players that you want me to look into, especially from a Supercoach perspective, where they like might have a role change, or looking at Max Gawn as a number one ruck. So I think like without Grundy, he was averaging 18 points more just from the hit-outs to advantage in the midfield zone. So like things like that, like you're getting these boosts with Sinclair. With Sinclair's example, he's not getting those points inside D50 that are worth a bit more because he's playing midfield. He might be doing the same things overall, but he's just not quite getting that boost. And I think there's around a 17-point drop-off in games where he played predominantly midfield.
Yeah, and each of those individual statistics, if you're losing 20% on each one, the more he gets involved, the more he's missing out. 20% here, 20% here, 20% here. It does, come the end of the game, feel like his output didn't match, like in terms of his scoring, didn't match the impact that he had on the game. And I know there's a bunch of other players that you sort of feel that way, that you don't quite understand why. But now that you've sort of told us about that 20% difference today, I think it goes a long way to explaining, I suppose, that there is a method behind the madness. There is a reasoning, and it really is a science.
Yeah, and it's really important to consider that for players coming up in 2024. Took a bit of a look into Hayden Young. We know he's going to be moving into the midfield more. And like basically last year, after that split of moving into the midfield, his tackle numbers were significant enough to bump him with a better average, and he's losing points for those like long kicks out of D50 that Freo do quite a lot of, but he's gaining that more back. He's gaining that and more back from tackles compared to Sinclair, who does kind of the same thing, but he just doesn't quite do enough in the midfield to make up for that. So there's a lot of considerations you need to have for 2024, and it's examples like that that can really give you the edge.
Yeah, definitely.
I think that also just a little idea based on what you just said there. I think I read somewhere today that under Adam Uze, Richmond are looking to kick the ball longer with a different sort of game style. And if that is the case, then it could mean that Richmond players all of a sudden become a little bit more, I suppose, statistically viable as options, because the long kicks are worth more when it comes to Supercoach scoring. So maybe someone like a Jaden Short or a Baker, for example, all of a sudden becomes a bit more viable, right?
Yeah, and you think about that Fremantle model of how many long kicks they had last year, just like so much time in D50 and then kicking it long, trying to get it forward. They didn't really have the options they needed ahead of the ball, so there's plenty of long kicks going around. Richmond could end up in a similar scenario this year where they have those defenders and mids scoring pretty decently. So, yeah, that's certainly something to look forward to if they do go for that.
Awesome.
All right, guys. I think that might be us for today. Thank you again, Jaden, for jumping on. It's been amazing. And maybe we'll check in with you throughout the season and kind of see if there's any players that we should be watching out for. What do you reckon?
Yeah, that sounds great. And like I've said, the ability that I have now to break down player stats even more just really opens up the world of Supercoach for me a lot easier. There's a lot more things I can do with it. And yeah, so I've said my socials already, but yeah, I'd be more than happy to jump on and talk through some of the players that are having changes to those score breakdowns.
Yeah, we'll definitely, like I said, we'll definitely have your socials in the comment section down below, in the description down below. So please, guys, head on over to Jaden's socials and follow him there, because he is, as you can tell, an amazing guy who is willing to give up his time. We've got another one. He's hooked into Supercoach, guys, and he's got the stats to back it up. So if you like what you saw here today, please drop us a like. Would greatly appreciate the growth of our channel, and a subscription as well as hitting that notification bell to make sure you don't miss out on any of the content that we're pumping out.
And remember, guys, we've got our Supercoach League competition happening at the moment. 3 amazing prizes. We'll put the information down in the description. This was the first episode of our beginner series. We're going to touch on a few other things, kind of giving everyone the tools to help build your team, help build your knowledge, and help build for a win.
Exactly. It might not all be as long as this one, but we really hope you enjoyed watching it as much as we enjoyed filming it. So remember, guys, here at the Centre Bounce, we do the hard work so that you guys don't have to.
Bye for now.